Okay, check this out. Can you see this? All right, let's zoom in. This is a denarius. Now, I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but this is going to be a big deal in season 5 of The Chosen, because at one point, just like in the Bible, Jesus is going to be asked about this. And how Jesus answers that question is going to determine whether people welcome him as the Messiah or reject him as a false prophet. But here's the thing. We already know how he answers that question. It's in the Bible. But the question is, do we know what it means? Because how we understand this coin not only impacts how we understand some critical moments in season 5, it also answers one central question about our relationship with God that almost every single one of us is asking. Let me show you. At one point, some religious leaders asked Jesus his thoughts on paying taxes to Caesar. And this is one of those moments where we can't forget where Jesus is, because it's absolutely essential to what's happening. Scripture tells us that Jesus is talking to the religious leaders within the temple courts. And here's why that's important. Because the denarius was actually forbidden in the temple because it bore the image of Caesar. And Caesar claimed to be a god. But here's the crazy thing. When Jesus asks them to show him a denarius, one of the religious leaders actually pulls it out of his pocket. It was pagan money in God's temple. It was a graven image, a clear violation of the second commandment. It had an inscription on it that claimed that Caesar was a god. Essenes refused to even touch or look at this coin, and yet this priest has it in his pocket. But there's more, because in Scripture, we see that the specific tax that they're asking Jesus about here is kensos. Now, this word refers to a poll tax, and there was a lot of history behind this poll tax. You see, back in 60 AD, Caesar Augustus put an end to the rule of Herod's family in Judea. And then he required people of that region to pay him taxes. Well, as all of this is happening, a man named Judas of Galilee raises up a group of people to oppose this taxation. And eventually, Judas was joined by a Pharisee named Zadok to organize a rebellion against Rome. And here's why this matters at the time of Jesus. According to Josephus, these men were responsible for the political instability that ultimately led to the downfall of Jerusalem. Their revolution led to war after war after war. Many died, there were robberies, influential men were murdered. Often the revolutionaries would end up killing or harming their own Jewish people. And as a result of all of it, there were famines throughout the region, and the temple of God was burned to the ground. Well, at the time of Jesus, the impact of these men and their revolution was growing towards a fever pitch, and Jesus is being put on the spot. Basically, he's being asked if he supports Rome or if he supports the revolution. But it's a lose-lose situation. If he supports Rome, he's a sellout and not worthy of calling himself the Messiah. But if he rejects Rome, he's a traitor and he'll be killed. Which is why Jesus' response is so amazing. Like we said earlier, Jesus asks them to bring him a denarius. And then he asks them to note whose inscription and image are on the coin. And the answer, of course, is Caesar, specifically Tiberius Caesar. And so Jesus commands them, well, then give to Caesar the things of Caesar, and give to God the things of God. And with this one statement, Jesus communicates two powerful things. First, he's telling people to be subject to the political authorities who are in power. But at the same time, he's also telling them to make sure that their primary allegiance is to God. But what I don't want you to miss here is how rich this point is. He's saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, because the image of the emperor is literally on this coin. Jesus is saying, it's got his image on it. It belongs to him. But at the same time, Jesus is reminding people of another image that is even more important. He says, give to God what is God's. In other words, return to God that which bears God's image. Well, what bears God's image? Us. People, humanity, we are the image of God. Genesis says, in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. We belong to God. And think about who he's talking to. The religious leaders. The same religious leaders who Jesus has been condemning for the past few seasons. He's inviting them to return their hearts back to God. But wait, because it's about to get even more amazing. You see, the show rushes past this kind of quickly, but I want you to see it because it's really significant in Scripture. Not long after the question about taxes, one of the religious leaders asks Jesus, which is the greatest of all the commandments? And Jesus responds by quoting a passage from Deuteronomy called the Shema. This was a passage that Jewish people would recite twice a day, every day, especially the religious leaders. And so Jesus says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength." Now, this is a big deal. But to understand why, we have to look at the actual Hebrew words here, because they mean something different than what we think they do in English. For instance, the word heart is the Hebrew word levav. And when we think of the heart, we tend to think of it as a place where we store our emotions and our feelings. But that's not the case in Hebrew. In Hebrew culture, the heart was the center of the mind. It was where you held your thoughts. So Jesus is saying that we must love God with every one of our thoughts. And then he says we must love God with all of our soul. And this is the word nephesh. But again, it's not what we think. Your nephesh isn't a spirit that lives inside of you. It's a reference to your entire life. Jesus is saying that we must love God with every part of our lives, our every action, everything on our calendar. All of this must be an act of love for God. And then finally, he says that we must love God with all of our strength. And this is the Hebrew word me'od. And it's a tricky one because me'od literally means very. He's saying love God with all of your very. But in essence, what it means is love God with all of your oomph. Love God with every ounce of energy you've got. But then Jesus does something surprising. He adds another scripture. After Jesus quotes the Shema, he follows it up with a passage from Leviticus and says, "Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." And this also is a big deal. Because you see, when Jesus uses this passage from Leviticus, he's incorporating a rabbinical practice called gezerah sheva. It basically means a comparison of equals. It's where you connect two passages through a common word. And the word Jesus is using to connect these passages is love. In other words, what Jesus is saying is that in order to truly love God, you must love your neighbor. But there's more. Because when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, that phrase, as yourself, is the Hebrew word kamocha. And this word isn't just meant to make a connection between the way you love your neighbor and the way you love yourself. The comparison isn't between two types of love. The comparison is between your neighbor and you. Jesus isn't commanding us to try to manufacture some sort of love for our neighbor that mirrors the way we love ourselves. He's asking us to take it even deeper. He's saying, I want you to see your neighbor as you, to realize that you are the same. Because when you realize that, then loving them the same way you love yourself is going to be a natural thing. But here's the crazy thing about this. Think about who Jesus is saying this to. He's saying it to his enemies. He's saying it to the people who just tried to fool him into saying something that might get him killed. Jesus has just been attacked by his enemies, and now he's offering them grace. These people have strayed from their relationship with God. They've strayed from their responsibility to bear God's image to the rest of the world. They've rejected the Messiah. And yet Jesus still wants them to know that there is hope. This is the subtle beauty happening in this moment that is so easy to miss in the episode. It's this reminder that none of us is too far gone to receive God's grace. And if you'd like to learn more about this and where it appears in The Chosen, then check out my new book, The Forgotten Teachings of Jesus, Rediscovering the Bible with The Chosen Season 1. There's a link above or down below. And if you'd like to see another video that will help you dive deeper into Season 5, then just click this link right here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.